I won't tell you her age, she may. But she has just come back from 3 weeks touring America, speaking sometimes a couple of times a day.
Yeah,
I
3
just,
or 4 times sometimes.
I just don't know how she does it, because she devotes her life to not only travelling all over the UK, but travelling all around the world to make sure that people know as much as they possibly can about not only her story, but the story of her family and the story of all those that perished in the Holocaust. And she has a very powerful message, the reason why she tirelessly does this and has been doing it since 1986, when you first spoke at the opening of the first ever Anne Frank exhibition in London. I've heard Eva speak, I've known her since 1989, and I've probably heard Eva speak 100 times. And some of you who are here tonight, I know, have also heard Eva speak several times. But there is always something new, there is always something fresh, there's always a new perspective, there's always a new link to what is going on in the world today. And that's why it's so important and so wonderful that there are so many young people here tonight, because that is why, that is so important that you hear it. Because you will have the great responsibility at some stage of telling this story yourself and passing this story on to your children and to your grandchildren. So, without further ado, I am going to introduce Eva Schloss MBE to you, and she's going to tell you her story for about 25 minutes, half an hour, and that will be followed by a question and answer session. So if you hear anything you'd like to know a bit more about, store it up and ask a question a bit later on.
Thank you, Gillian, for your nice introduction. Well, when I look back on my life, it is all really many amazing coincidences put together. Through the horrible events in Germany and Austria, through the rise of Hitler, families who would never have met each other came together. Our family came from Austria, we were there for generations, and the Frank family came from Germany, from Frankfurt, and eventually we came together, and we'll hear a bit more about that. If Hitler wouldn't have been, we would certainly never have met. Austrian people didn't go much to Germany, there was no great love lost with the Austrian and the German. We went to Hungary, to Czechoslovakia, to Italy, but Germany was same language, but it was not somewhere where Austrian people really went. So we would certainly never have come across the Frank family. Through our emigration, the Frank family in 1933 to Amsterdam, our family eventually through Belgium, eventually we ended up in February 1940 as well in Amsterdam, and on the same square, I think there is probably a photo in the exhibition, the Merwedeplein, where many refugees had settled. It was a kind of a new area. It was at that time the highest building in Amsterdam, the Wolkenkrabber skyscraper, and you can see there was a big open space. If you go there now, there are trees everywhere, cars are parked, but at the time it was nice space for children to play. And you know, in apartments you haven't got a garden where you could play, so all the children after school came out to play in the street. And I went to a school very nearby, and after school, where would we meet up with all the children in the street. And one day a little girl came to me and said, her name was Anne Frank, she came from Germany as well, Germany, Austria, German speaking, and she took me up to her apartment and I met her family. And for 2 years we were friends. Unfortunately, pretty short, because we came in February 1940. In May, we heard guns and aeroplanes, and we put on the radio and it said terrible news that Germans are invading our country. So it was a very short war, just 5 days, and the Dutch gave in, and the German army marched in. From then on, the measures against the Jewish population started to come. You will probably see that all in the exhibition. I won't go into this. It became very difficult for Jewish people to exist. They lost their jobs. We had to go to Jewish schools, we had to wear the yellow star, people were arrested. For 2 years we lived in fear. I had a brother who was 3 years older. He was 15 at the time, and his sister Margot as well. And in 1942, 10,000 young people, your age perhaps, got call-up notices to be deported to Germany to work camps. They never said what they really were going to do with those youngsters. And many, many unfortunate parents did send their children. And only later, after the war, did we hear they were just sent to Mauthausen and just murdered there. But that we didn't know at the time. But many parents decided they wouldn't send their children if we went into hiding. Well, I'm sure you're all aware about Otto Frank's story about the hiding. There were 8 people in Otto's office. They were there in hiding for 2 years, never going out, living in fear, very little food, and people got on their nerves, each other, you know, if you are cramped up. And eventually they were betrayed. Our family had to split up. I went with my mother, and my father went with my brother, because nobody wanted to take in so many people in a small apartment. This is something I have to stress. There were many, many wonderful Dutch people who risked their life to help Jewish people. Many of those resistance workers were arrested, many were shot, many were sent to concentration camps, many, many perished. And this is something I can't stress enough. I think we have lost this love for helping other people. I was once in a secondary school, and there was a whole day, there were workshops and sorting out what would happen and how it happened, and talks about everything. And towards the evening, late afternoon, there were about 6 groups of 10 children each, and they were asked, what would you do if, imagine you are parents and the neighbors ask you, I'm in danger of being arrested, could you help us? And you go and consider it, your husband and your wife together, you say, well, we have a family, what are we going to do? And it took a long time. Eventually, the spokesperson of all those 10 groups came and said, well, it took us a long time to decide, but we have really thought about it, but those are after all strangers to us. We have to look after our own family. Sorry, we can't help them. And I was very upset. I thought if that would have happened in Holland, many, many, many more people would have perished. And as well in Belgium and in France. So I said to them, well, that is sad, but on one hand I can understand a difficult decision to make, but I have a solution. And they all said, what is it? And I said we wouldn't live in a world where something like this won't happen. You won't be put into such a dilemma. And this is really what we have to work together, that there won't be a persecution of a minority group. So this is one of our messages. So we were in hiding as well for 2 years and were betrayed by a Dutch nurse. As I said, they were wonderful, the Dutch people, but nevertheless there was as well quite a considerable Nazi party. And they didn't always say who's aware, and you didn't know, so you didn't know who you could trust. And this Dutch nurse pretended she worked for the resistance, but she really worked with the Nazis. My father and brother had to change hiding place, and she said she knew a safe place. And so my father and brother went with her, and she took them to this house, and the next day they were arrested. 200 people were arrested in this particular house. And it was a couple, and that was the only woman after the war who was executed by the Dutch resistance people or the justice. So, that was on a Sunday, and we went to visit my father and brother because they'd come to it before they were in the country, and they'd come to live very near where we were, and so they followed us, and so all 4 of us were arrested. And it happened to be on my 15th birthday. So this is something I will, of course, always remember. Now people say you didn't know what was going on. We certainly did know very, very well, because it was the BBC who broadcast in every country in their own language. So in Dutch, in Holland we had it in Dutch, in France it was in French. In Holland it was at 9 o'clock, and it started with da 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 da, da 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 da, and we were glued to the radio, and we heard all the news about, in 1944 already, Germans were already starting to lose the war, so it looked much better. Invasion had already, Belgium and France had already been liberated, but they always, in every broadcast, mentioned the death camps and concentration camps in Germany and Poland. Over 300 of those camps were, and they did mention as well, Jewish people were systematically gassed there. So you can imagine when we were arrested, we thought, well, this will be our lot. We will go to a camp and we will be killed. You can imagine how we felt. Terrible, of course. So after a very short journey, first to Westerbork, a holding camp, we were put on transport. We were arrested on a Tuesday. On Sunday, we were already in Auschwitz. Auschwitz again is a little town, a Polish town with a big station. We got there and we got out of the cattle truck and we saw the sign Auschwitzim and Auschwitz, both languages, and we knew what it meant. So you can imagine how we felt. The next command, men and women to different sides. This is when I had to say goodbye to my father and brother. My father, through several miracles, I saw again. My brother I never ever saw again. The same thing Otto describes this on the platform when he was separated from his wife and his two daughters. He never saw them, he never knew really what happened exactly to them. So we entered the camp. No, the next selection was Mengele. You might have heard, the camp doctor stood there, immaculately dressed, polished boots, white gloves, and he looked you over and he directed you this side or this side, like a conductor. One side was life, the other one was immediate death. But of course we didn't realize that. But all young children, all older people went to one side, the others to the other side. Luckily my mother and me marched into the camp. We walked into a barrack, the next thing, undressed completely naked. All our hair was shaved, we were all tattooed. And while this was going on, they told us with much pleasure that the family we have been separated from were told they were going to go to a shower. And they did go, of course. Would be wonderful after this horrible journey to freshen up a bit. And they stood there in a barrack with pipes and shower heads, and nothing happened. And they waited and waited, and they started to have breathing difficulties and started to feel faint. They fell to the floor, and within 10 minutes everybody had been killed, because no water came but poisonous gas. And they told us that, so you can imagine how people who had just a mother or just lost her daughter or her child, how people felt. And then we were told, and now it's your turn to go in the shower. Well, we didn't want to go, we were beaten into it, but eventually we did go and water came. So that was, of course, the first day we had survived, but we never knew what was going to happen. We were in the camp for 9 months under horrible conditions, and sometimes when I look back and think back, I'm even amazed that me or anybody else could have survived this, but some people did. Very often through very small little incidences, little miracles. And towards the winter it was bitter, bitter cold. Sometimes we had no shoes. We had here a cold spell, but it was much colder even than there. Without clothes, without warm food, without blankets. I had terrible frostbite on my feet. And the Germans, we realized, became very nervous. It wasn't so strict anymore. The gas chambers at crematorium had been blown up. And they took every day emptied barracks and took many, many tens of thousands of people out of the camp, and they marched into Austria and Germany. That was as well the time when Anna and Margot were taken out of Auschwitz and sent to Bergen-Belsen. Again, by luck, my mother and me didn't go. But most people really wanted to go, because the rumor had been spread when the Germans were leaving, they're going to lock up the barracks, there were wood, and burn it all down. And of course nobody wanted to be burned alive. But somehow that didn't happen. The Germans ran away, they left, and about 300 women were left in Auschwitz, Birkenau. Birkenau was the women's camp. And we were for about 10 days alone. We could have gone out, but we didn't dare to. We didn't know where to go. We didn't know what was outside, were the Germans still outside, so we stayed. And then one day, the first Russian soldier came. That was, of course, amazing. But again, on the other hand, we didn't know what were they going to do. Were they going to look after us? Were they going to perhaps even kill us? You know, it was still a great uncertainty. But they left again, and more Russians came and they fed us and left again, because they were pursuing the Germans. There was fierce, fierce, fierce fighting going on in Poland, because the Russians wanted, of course, to get into Germany, but the Germans didn't want the Russians in there, as you can imagine. And later, when they did go into Berlin and in other cities, of course, they committed terrible atrocities, because they revenged themselves on the terrible suffering the Russians had suffered from the Germans. But to us, they were very, very good. We decided we would go to the men camps to try to find my father and brother, which we did, and we searched all the barracks, all the bunks. There were again about 300 men left there. And we came across two people who we had known in Amsterdam before. And one of them was Otto Frank, Anna's father. We just about recognized each other. I can tell you, we looked like skeletons. But, you know, we questioned, are you Otto Frank? And he said, are you Eva Geringer? And of course, the first question, have you seen my family? And we hadn't, of course. Then the Russians decided they would take us out of Auschwitz, and we traveled for 4 months deep into Russia, till Odessa. And there we were housed, and there we waited for the end of the war, which was, of course, the first time really that we realized we had survived and had made it. That was in May. So then we waited for a troop transport ship, which came, the New Zealand boat, and we went back to the west, to France, all along up north to Belgium, and eventually into Amsterdam. And there we stood, nobody took any notice of us, and because till then we had really always been looked after by everybody, but the Dutch did it as if we didn't exist, and we were quite shocked. But later we realized why it was, because Holland had been occupied till the peace, and the Germans took everything the Dutch produced to Germany to feed their own people and clothe their own people. And it was called in Holland the hunger winter. Tens of thousands of people starved to death, literally starved to death. People ate tulip bulbs, burnt their own furniture for some warmth. And so when more refugees came, more people who had nothing, they didn't really know what to do with them. So eventually Otto went to Gies, who was one of the helpers, who lived in the same area on the Merwedeplein, and of course he took him in, was very, very happy that he had returned, was very anxious what will happen with the girls. And Otto too had great hope that these two girls would still return. We were able to go to our own apartment, because when we came late into Holland, my father took a furnished apartment belonging to a Christian, and so they let us move back in. And we waited for news. Eventually we got, about after 6 weeks, we got news from the Red Cross that both my father and brother had perished in Mauthausen, which was a horrific Austrian camp. And several days before the American army came to liberate that camp. Otto came as well to tell us that he had heard his whole family had perished. You can't imagine how this man felt. He was 57 years old at the time, and when he left, you know, it was just a very, very sad figure who, and my mother and me said, well, how can this man carry on with his life? A few days later he came again, and he had a little brown paper parcel in his hand, and he said, I must show you something. And he opened it really very, very carefully, and guess what it was? Anne Frank's diary, that's right. And he opened it and started to read a few lines, but almost burst into tears. It was just too emotional for him. But this little book gave him a purpose again, and he carried it always with him. And he always said, I feel as if my little girl is still with me. So he came regularly to our house to see how we were doing. I was a very miserable teenager. Didn't really want to go back to school. I hated everybody, and not only the Germans, but the whole world, because I realized if the free countries like America, Canada, Australia would have let more Jewish people in, all this wouldn't have happened. So I was really very, very bitter. And of course as well, being betrayed by a Dutch nurse, I didn't trust Dutch people, and it was really very, very hard. And the other thing was very, very difficult. I just didn't accept that my father and brother had disappeared. And I've heard that was similar with September 11, when people went to work and just didn't return at night, and there was no trace found of them. The family just couldn't believe that they had disappeared from this earth. So this made it even much more difficult. And as well, there was no counseling, you couldn't talk about it, nobody wanted to hear. I was desperate to talk about my experience, but people didn't want to know. They said, well, it was difficult for everybody, and let's not talk about it, let's move on. So all survivors suppressed it, and then later, 10 years later, 15 years later, when people started to question, we were not ready anymore to talk. So I went back to school, was quite miserable. When I finished school, I didn't really care, I didn't know what I wanted to do, and Otto had come very often to our house to help my mother as well, and me, and they discussed what shall we do with Eva, and Otto said, well, perhaps she should become a photographer. And I didn't really care, and I said, okay, and as a bonus, Otto gave me his camera. It's a very beautiful Leica. He had it since the 1920s. It was at that time one of the best cameras which existed. And I've just heard recently they make now even a digital Leica, looking exactly like it, but it's of course much easier to handle. Anyway, he gave me this camera to encourage me to become a good photographer like he was himself. He had lots of photos of his children, and he said he's not interested at all anymore in photography. He doesn't want to take any more pictures. So I went to a studio in Holland first, but I was really very unhappy in Holland. I had some good memories, but you know, the memory when we were together as a family, and this, I just couldn't bear it. And so Otto knew somebody in London who had a photographic studio, and I came to London for a year as an apprentice to learn photography. And I came here, and I lived in a little boarding house in Cricklewood, where a Czech lady that made it her job to take in about 6, 8 young people from different countries, and as well some English people. And there was this young man from Israel who had come to study economics. And you know, you earn £2, 10 shillings, which was very little. And you had to pay your fare, your lodging, your food. And so we had no money to go to shows or to even to the cinema. And so we went for long walks on Hampstead Heath and different parks and talked about the future. But we never ever talked about who we really were, what had happened to us. Not he, not me either. And after 6 months, we became very close, and one day he said to me, Eva, I've fallen in love with you, and let's get married and start a new life and go to Israel. Because he intended to go back when he finished studying. And I said, I feel very honored, thank you, but no way, because I have a widowed mother in Amsterdam, and when my year is over here, I'm going to go back to be with her. And so Otto Frank came over one day, and I told him that, and he said, well, you know, while you were away, your mother and me have fallen in love as well, and when you get settled, we like to get married as well. So this is what happened. We got married in 1952, and Otto and my mother got married in 1953. And they were married for 27 years, and I must say I've never seen a happier marriage than those two. And 1952, so we are married this year 60 years. And when I tell that in schools, very often children say, surely not the same husband. But it is. And I still never talked about, not to him, of course, when we went, we spent many, many holidays together with Otto and my mother, and Otto, of course, continuously talked about Anne and about the books and about the letters they got from all over the world. So my husband started to realize the story, but I never told him that I've been in Auschwitz or anything about that. Then when we got our children, our first daughter was born in 1956, and then later we had 3 children, never told them anything about it. And Otto was a wonderful grandfather to them. This is really for us, for the family, and for Otto was very, very important. He really considers them as his grandchildren. So in a way we had again a family. Otto and my mother moved to Switzerland. They wanted to start a new life as well, but went every month for a week to Amsterdam to be in touch with what was going on with the museum. And it grew and grew. They had many, many, many thousands of visitors coming every year, and now it is actually more than 1 million. And of course it has changed a lot, because with so many, the houses and the canals are quite delicate, you know, with wooden staircases, and you couldn't have thousands of people going out, up and down the same, so they had to rebuild it. It lost a little bit of the authenticity, of course, but it's still, of course, a very, very moving place, because the rooms are there. You can see the small size of it and the cramped accommodation, and as well that there was really no view. The only thing Anne could see was a big, beautiful chestnut tree, and she heard the the church there. Those were really her only contact with the outside world. So, like Gillian has said, first in 1986, the first exhibition, a bit different from this, but it was called Anne in the World from 1929 to 1945, a short life. And it came to London, the first foreign exhibition. And it was opened by Ken Livingstone, and it was a very, very moving first event. Many, many people were invited, and there was a head table there, and about 5, 6 people sat there and make speeches. And Ken Livingstone said to me, come and sit with us up there on the head table, which I did. And at the end he said, and now Eva will want to say a few words. Well, I can tell you I wanted to crawl under the table. I had never spoken before in public, and certainly not about a subject like that. So it was really, I stood there looking up at all the people, expecting something for me to say, and eventually I opened my mouth and didn't stop, because everything what I had suppressed for 40 years came flooding out. And it was for me really a big change, a big watershed, because after that, the exhibition, first it went to different places in London, and they always asked me to come and say a few words and open it. Then it went to Leeds and to Aberdeen and to many places, and they always asked me to come. I was not a speaker at all. My husband had to write the speech for me. I was very, very embarrassed to stand in front of a crowd.